Namaste, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of the podcast that we are doing as part of the EkaShri Schools of Yoga. So, as we've been doing in the past, like we've mentioned before, we've had a couple of different 30 to 45-minute episodes of these little podcasts where we discuss key concepts within yoga philosophy. And as I'm sure you all are aware by now, for those of you who have been listening, the goal of these podcasts has really been to figure out and really highlight what the real world applications and the practical applications of these different principles within yoga philosophy are, and how we can think about bringing these into our daily life, both on and off the mat. So we've been going through a couple of different topics over the past couple of weeks related to the Ashtanga Yoga set of principles. And, to the extent you do have any questions or have any topics that you would like to contribute for us to cover, feel free to let us know at info@ekashri.yoga, and we would be happy to accommodate to the extent possible. So with that, why don't we go ahead and delve into our topic for today? So today we will be discussing Dhyana, which is the second to last limb in Ashtanga Yoga. And we've been discussing all of the previous limbs of Ashtanga Yoga and the philosophy that it contains over the last couple of weeks. So why don't we go ahead and just start, Shriramji, with the word dhyana itself. So what does the word dhyana actually mean? And I know it means something along the lines of contemplation and reflection, but I think those are two powerful words to begin with. So in your mind, what does the word dhyana actually mean?
Namaste Vedantji and namaste everyone. So the way dhyana is usually translated is meditation, and there's a very specific way in which Maharishi Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras he describes what dhyana is, and we will look into that. And also to help our understanding, we will look at a few metaphors to have a mental image or a mental picture of what's going on in a state of dhyana when we are experiencing it, when we are practicing it. So dhyana, as you mentioned, it is the seventh limb of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga Yoga. And the definition of dhyana, I'll quote the sutra first, and then we will look into what it means. Patanjali says, dhyana is tatra pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam. Tatra pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam. So what does it mean? When the same picture remains in the mind from one moment to the next. In other words, the same content of the mind persists from one moment to the next. This state of mind is called dhyana. So this is a very surface level definition or a literal translation. But let's delve a little deeper to gain a deeper understanding of what is dhyana. So when we look at the world, we have seen before in one of the previous sessions that we are engaging with the world through what is reflected in the mind. Whatever we see in the outside world is actually thanks to the mental picture of it that is created in what is called a chitta. So Patanjali calls it chitta. An image of a tree, for example, when we are looking at a tree, an image is created in the back of the eye, and the sensors, the optical nerves, they carry that signal and present it in the screen of the mind, which is called the chitta. And the content that appears in this chitta is called pratyaya. So pratyaya, this technical word, pratyaya, is basically the sum total of all the contents in the screen called chitta in this instant of time. So it's a snapshot of the contents of chitta in this moment of time. Now, usually in our everyday experience, this content keeps shuffling around, it keeps changing because the chitta is a dynamic thing, and we have allowed our mind to keep wandering or to keep distracted, for example, and it keeps changing from time to time. The contents keeps changing from time to time. Whereas meditation or dhyanam is that state in which the content remains the same. From one moment to the next, the content remains the same. Now, why is this important, and What does it mean? How does it benefit us? It is to deepen our understanding, let's look at a few metaphors. If we think of the mind like a surface of a lake, in fact, this analogy is given in one of the sections in Ramayana, where the author Valmiki, when he was walking by a river, he looks at the surface of the river. It is so calm, it is not turbulent, and he describes that as similar to the mind of a yogi. Mind of a yogi in meditation. It is so calm, he says. So when we look at, say, a lake, a surface of a lake that is not agitated, you place some content on it, maybe a flower on the surface of the lake. It doesn't move about. It remains in the same spot from one moment to the next. So such is the state of mind in meditation. The same content persists across time. So this is how we picture Dhyana in yoga. And there are other metaphors that are given. For example, Bhagavad Gita gives the analogy of a flame, like a flame of a candle in a windless place. So the mind is bright, the mind is alert, but it is not agitated, it's not flickering, it is steady. The appearance of the flame from one moment to the next is identical. You see, the flame looks the same from one moment to the next. So that is another analogy that is given. And a third analogy, a classic analogy that is given, is called Taila Dharavat. That means when we pour oil, when we don't pour it too fast, when we pour it very slowly, when you look at it from a distance, you see a thin thread, a thin stream of the movement of the oil, but you actually don't see the movement. You just see a single thread of oil, and it appears same from one moment to the next. So there is a flow, but you cannot see the flow from a distance. You see just a thin thread of oil, and this state of mind, where the mind is active, there is a flow in the mind, and we will come back, we will revisit this flow later, and it appears identical from one moment to the next. So this is also a metaphor that is given for meditation. So one of the modern examples, if we were to give, it is for example, when we watch a computer screen. So when we watch a video on a computer screen or on your smartphone, so the video is actually presented frame by frame. There are about 60 images, that 60 frames that run by every second, or 120 depending on the refresh rate, right? So pictures are running by very fast, and it gives the impression of movement. Now in a state of meditation, what happens is, if we were to picture a still image, you still have this frame by frame. They're running by at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, but all the frames, they present the same content, and it gives us the appearance of stillness. You see? So this is the state of meditation that is described. Pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam. Pratyaya is the contents of the mind, and ekatanata, tana means to stretch it, and in this context, we stretch that same content across time. The same image appears from one moment to the next. So this is meditation.
Yeah, wow, that's a very, I think, profound explanation of the topic, and a lot to unpack there. So I guess, a couple of, maybe delving a little bit deeper into that, Shriramji, right? So even at the very beginning, what you said, right, about how we basically, you gave the analogy of how, for example, when we think about visualizing something, right, or even input that comes into the eye, it then goes back into the brain. It has that screen there on which it's projected, and then your sensory nerves and neurons and whatever then allow you to make sense and create this mental picture of what exactly you saw. So to be clear, is that a purely what you're focusing on in Dhyana? Is that a purely objective picture, quote unquote, if you will, or do you, through the process of having that sensory input and all that stuff, does that then become a subjective picture rather than an objective picture? So which one of the two is it, or is that maybe not even a sort of a issue here?
Yes, in fact, Patanjali talks about the types of contents. These contents are called vrittis. the activities of the mind. And early on in the Yoga Sutras, he talks about 5 types of vrittis. So the image that is created when we sense an object outside, perhaps we see the object or we hear a sound or we taste something. So whenever we gain that vritti through the outside world, through one of the 5 senses, they come under the category of pratyaksha. Pratyaksha means it's obvious, it comes through the senses. Akshi means eyes. And here it's an example of all the 5 senses. So any input that comes from the senses, so pratyaksha. But the contents of the mind can come from within as well. For example, imagination can be a content of the mind. We can visualize something. It's not there outside, but we create a mental image of it. Dream is an example of a content of the mind that doesn't exist outside, but it is existing only in the chitta of the person who's experiencing the dream, you see. So regardless of how that content is created in the chitta, regardless of what vritti it is, if the same content, the snapshot of the pratyaya, which is the all the vrittis in the canvas of the mind, if we can think like that, if the same uh, pratyaya, it persists across time, then this is called dhyana.
Got it. So then it can basically, so this can also be a very abstract thought, for example, that we think about in picture. It doesn't necessarily have to be some kind of focus or contemplation on something that is necessarily physical or out there in the external world, which makes sense because for a lot of people, right, meditation is much more of an internal practice. There are certain tenets, principles, certain things you fixate on only because, you these internal things are what then allow you to get into that meditative state versus some kind of an external stimulus, if you will. So that makes a lot of sense. And so, so now that we have the picture and the context of, dhyana and what exactly it is, both I think, as much as we've tried to define it, we can only put it into so many words, and we have to think metaphorically about what the actual explanation and meaning of the word is. But I think, one thing that, would definitely help myself and the listeners probably is just thinking a little bit more about why this contemplation, this reflection in dhyana, why it's important, and what exactly its role or benefit, for us personally could be. And so I guess maybe we'll start with just the first part of that question, which was what is the purpose and why do we even think about dhyana, and why is it important to take into account?
In fact, in the yoga literature, there are so many things that are said about the benefits of dhyana, benefits of meditation. And let us unpack one at a time. So, the first obvious benefit of meditation is that we are conserving energy. We are not allowing the energies of the mind. So, whenever we project a content in the canvas of the mind, when we change the pratyaya, it consumes some energy. When the thoughts are running in a very turbulent manner, it depletes energy. So we get exhausted very soon. And when we examine the thoughts that run in the mind, most of the thoughts are not really high quality Nobel Prize winning thoughts, right? Most of the thoughts are mundane, trivial thoughts. They just come up and they go away, and it mind gets distracted with the next thing and something totally unrelated. So we keep changing the contents of the mind from one moment to the next, and this depletes our energy. So that is one aspect. When we keep the same content from one moment to the next, then we are conserving that energy. And more importantly, whenever the mind is turbulent, when the pratyas keep changing very fast, then it leads to wear and tear because there's chaos in the mind. We can think of it as more entropy is created in the mind. There is more wear and tear that happens, and we get stressed out. There is more negative emotions, anxiety, stress, frustration, and so forth. So, in the experience of dhyanam, in the meditation, when the pratyaya is identical from one moment to the next, there is an experience of peace. In fact, Patanjali describes this very beautifully. He says that peace is not just a static lethargic peace, it's a dynamic peace. He calls it Prashanta Vahita Samskarat. Prashanta means total peace, complete peace. Vahita. Vahita means that which is moving. The English word vehicle or the Sanskrit word vahanam, they come from the same root, that which is moving, that which carries the flow, but the flow is so peaceful and tranquil. Such is the quality of the experience of peace. It is not a static, dull peace, lethargic peace. There is a dynamic peace. It is like, when we study fluid dynamics, we talk about fluid flow as being either turbulent flow or a streamlined laminar flow. In a turbulent flow, it is like open the tap too fast and then you get gushing water flow, right? Whereas when it is a very controlled, streamlined laminar flow of water or oil, as we saw in the previous example, when we look at it from a distance, you don't see any change. The same picture is there. So one of the results in the fluid dynamics is that when we want to transport fluid from one place to another, if you want to flow the fluid and if you want to use the least energy expenditure to move the fluid from one place to another, the best way to do it is by laminar flow. We conserve that energy. We are not dissipating the energy, the most energy efficient way. Now, when we examine our chitta, the screen of the mind, the chitta actually lies in the realm of what is called the prakriti. That means the inert world. And it is said in yogic literature that anything that lies in prakriti always keeps changing. There is always activity there. There is always actions there. Bhagavad Gita says, Nahi kaschit kshanamapi jatu tishtati akarma kriti. That means not even for a fraction of a second is there complete stillness. There is always movement in the realm of the prakriti. But what happens in Dhyana, in meditation, is there is movement, there is flow, but the movement creates the same image in the next frame. You see, the same pratyaya persists. It moves to recreate the same image. It moves again to create the same image. So that flow remains identical from one moment to the next. You see, so that experience of peace is there, the experience of dynamic peace. It's not just a static peace, but an exhilarating peace, if you can imagine that. So that is the experience of meditation. So apart from the experience of peace, there are other very profound benefits of meditation that are also given. For example, in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali says, Dhyana heyas tadvrittayaha. That means by the practice of dhyanam, the vrittis of the kleshas, that means the activities of the miserable emotions. We can translate kleshas or afflictions or misery. So the miseries can be removed by the practice of meditation. Miseries can be removed by the practice of meditation. And then later on in the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali gives a very fascinating benefit of meditation. So would you like to know what he says? I find this very fascinating. He says, Tatra dhyanajam anashayam. That means whatever thoughts or actions that we are inspired to do or think when we are in meditation, they will not bind us in future. They will not create negative karma, he says. Tatra dhyanajam anashayam. Ashaya means accumulation. And here it refers to accumulation of karma or consequences that will accrue and it will show up in the future. You see? So what Patanjali is saying is, the thoughts that are inspired from a place of meditation will always free us. They will be high quality thoughts. You see? They will not be thoughts that bind us or create misery for us in future. And we have all experienced it, right? Only when the mind is miserable, we say or do things where we have to apologize for, or we have to mend the things that we broke, you see. Whereas in a meditative state, we are in our best behavior naturally. We are always kind to people and we are always doing things with full awareness that we don't have to apologize or we don't have to fix things because we broke them. We always take the right decisions, the highest quality decisions from a place of meditation. So all these are some of the benefits of meditation. And one more thing, I gave the analogy of the lake. When the surface of the lake is tranquil, you place an object like a flower on the surface of the lake and it remains in the same spot. When the surface of the lake is still, you can see the depth of the lake. because there's no turbulence, you can see the depth of that lake. That means when the mind is really tranquil, you are connected, you're anchored to yourself. So, whatever values or the core values that are important to you, your actions will abide by that. You see, your actions will be consistent with your values. Many times we take this decision, okay, I'll be a kind person, I'll be a loving person, I don't want to hurt others, I want to spread joy, I want to be joyful and spread joy. So like this we all have very good intentions, I hope, right? All of us have these intentions deep within, but many times we exhibit actions or behavior that express the opposite, right? Especially to near and dear ones, we give them a generous dose of anger, right? That's because in that moment we are not connected to that conviction or to that decision or to that ethical values that are important to us, because we are not seeing the depth of who we are. The mind is turbulent. So when the mind is in meditation, what happens is we are able to see the depth of that lake. That means we are anchored to ourselves. We are rooted to ourselves. All our actions that we do will be consistent with the values that we espouse, the values that are important to us: honesty, integrity, and being non-violent. All the yamas and niyamas, they come naturally when we are in a state of meditation. You see? So these are all so many profound benefits of meditation. So it's not just a feeling good level thing. Meditative state of mind transforms our life, because during the course of the day, when we live our life, we are a better person. We give others the gift of presenting them the highest version of who we are, the best version of who we are. Not a frustrated, angry version of ourselves, but the best person of who we are.
No, and that's, I think, really beautifully explained, Shriramji. So thank you for the just walking through all of that on a very concrete basis. So a couple of things that stood out to me, right? It makes a lot of sense, and just the fact that I think goes back to this whole concept about how everything we do in yoga practice, whether it's on the mat physically or whether it's off the mat, more from a living like with the Ashtanga Yoga principles, it's not a passive thing, right? But it's rather an active process. And it may be, maybe contradictory is not the right word. It may be paradoxical to a certain extent. Like, for example, you mentioned, right, where peace is actually an active process. It's not necessarily something that is just a very static state, right? And so that may seem paradoxical, I think, at first to people who have not really heard this sort of explanation or this term before, but it makes so much sense that if you're really in the static thing, it's not really peace, it's like sleep or slumber, that kind of lethargy, right, rather than actual active rationalized peace. And so having that sense of an active nature, but also not, that doesn't mean that the mind is so active or overactive to the point where you keep trying to say, oh, I need to be peaceful, I need to be peaceful, and then psych yourself up instead, right? That defeats the purpose. So there's that balance between being between lethargy, not caring, that passive nature, versus the other side, which is like just the monkey mind, where you need to have some meditative state, but you keep reminding yourself, winding yourself up to the point where you don't actually get into that state because you're not really at that peace, right? So that equilibrium, I think there's such a fine line between that. So that's a very interesting point that you...
Thank you for highlighting that, because that's a very profound experience. And let me give one more example that really illustrates this point. In Bhagavad Gita, there is a verse that talks about this. It says, Karmani akarmayah pashyet, akarmani cha karmayah, sabuddhiman manusheshu. That means an intelligent one, a yogi who is very sharp in the mind, they will notice that when they are meditating, when they are tranquil in the mind, they are also connected with the flow. There is a movement that they also experience. And vice versa, when they are dynamic in their activity, perhaps they are engaged in karma yoga. You see, dynamic in the activity, they are also anchored deeply within themselves. There is a place where they are deeply anchored, which is not moving, which is not turbulent. You see, so they both go hand in hand. And to give an example that most of us can relate to, when we are traveling on a flight, on an aircraft, 30,000 feet above the ground, and without any turbulence, There is no movement. It is just absolute peaceful. Everyone is perhaps sleeping, and we are just coursing along in the flight. No turbulence, nothing. It is very peaceful, and it has a very meditative quality to it, right? There is a flow that is happening. The aircraft is moving, but there is no turbulence, nothing, and there is a deeply meditative quality to it. Now, the same aircraft, if it is on the ground, it is not moving. Suppose we have to wait for 2 hours because there's a technical snag, or perhaps we're waiting for other aircrafts in the before us, and we're waiting for them. You see, it is not such a peaceful experience. In fact, people get restless and agitated and so forth. It's not really very meditative. So you see, when a laminar flow, the streamlined flow becomes peaceful, because from one moment to the next, it goes back to the same thing. You see, the pratyaya is the same. Then it's a profoundly meditative experience. It cannot be experienced just by sleep. That's a higher quality of experience, more bliss that we can consciously experience in that moment. And this is that's why, when great artists or people who are in the zone of excellence, they describe their experience as a flow, right? Like a flow experience. So when creativity comes, it comes like a flow. There is a peaceful quality to it. Or when we are exercising, when we are jogging, or when we are doing asanas, there comes a point where the mind becomes so tranquil. There's a flow. We are still moving the body, or perhaps we are still jogging, but then there is an experience of flow that happens. And there's also a best-selling book uh, with that same title, Flow. And I forget the author's name, but it's a very fascinating book that makes very similar points. And I was fascinated how some of the points that he makes echoes what we see in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. So there is a movement, a flow that we experience in meditation.
Wonderful. And so I think, on that point, I think the next logical question here would be, so we talked about, the fact that we have the mind, which is like you mentioned, this river, right? Where, for example, it's flowing very peacefully, it's flowing at a very natural state, right? There's no turbulence, right, involved in that. And so it's flowing very peacefully. And so that should be sort of akin to how we should think about the meditative state and being like that in our mind. So I guess the next logical question would be, how, Shriramji, as for the average practitioner, how should we think about being able to maintain that sort of, that fluid peace of mind and that fluid state of being, as opposed to having thoughts coming in and out, getting into that turbulent state, if you will, as opposed to that fluid state. So how should we think about that? And I guess what kind of tangible practices, if any, can we potentially use to help create that state of mind?
So the way they describe it in the classic yoga literature is the difference between the body and the mind. So for the body, we have asanas. And then for the mind, we have these three practices, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. The body, we can make things happen. We can drag the body out of the bed and bring the body inside the yoga mat and begin the yoga practice. You see, the asana practice. Whereas for meditation, the key word is allow. We cannot force meditation to happen. We can create the right conditions and the meditation happens automatically. It is allowed to happen rather than dragging it to happen or forcing it to happen. So we create the right conditions. So how do we create the right conditions? And there are many techniques. There are many classic texts. For example, there's a Vijnana Bhairava, which talks about 112 types of meditation methods. And they're all methods that create the right condition and meditation is allowed to happen. So we can pick and choose which method works best for us. So and I'll give some examples of what are some of those methods. So the point is, choose a technique of meditation or choose a method that works for you and you feel uplifted by it. Patanjali makes this statement. He says, Yathabhimata Dhyanadva. That means by whatever method that brings your mind into meditation, use it. Use it generously. Don't do one type today, one type tomorrow. Be consistent. Choose one that resonates with you. You see? So, what are some of the examples of practice of meditation? So, one way is to continue the process of dharana. So, from last episode, we saw what is dharana. Dharana is to bring the mind to a place of attention on a specific boundary. In other words, we limit the wandering mind within the boundary. We put a fence around it, right? Now, just like we saw metaphors for meditation, let us look at a metaphor for dharana and how we can extrapolate to make meditation happen, the dhyana happen. So we can think of dharana as you open the tap and you see drip by drip or drop by drop, the water is flowing down. You don't see a thin stream of water, but it is flowing in a trickle, one drop at a time. So that is a metaphor for dharana, you see. So there's one thought that is going towards the object, then the next thought that goes towards the object. Now, between two drops of water, there is space. Another thought can come, you see. Whereas meditation happens when it becomes a stream, there is no gap. It is the same stream of movement. The pratyaya is flowing identical from one moment to the next. So, to put it in practical terms, what is happening is when we are practicing dharana, we are trying to bring the attention to one place. Now, often we will notice that the mind has already wandered away. It has been distracted. It has gone elsewhere. And then we bring the mind back to the self. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says very beautifully, Yato yato nischarati manaschanchalamassthiram tatastato niyam yetad atmani eva vasham nayet. That means whenever you catch the mind going away from the object of focus, bring the mind back. In this case, it says bring the mind back to the self. So the mind will get distracted. Bring it back to the self. The mind will get distracted again. Bring it back to the self. You do it again and again. And there comes a time when the mind does not get distracted anymore. You see, it just keeps being with that object. That is when meditation happens. It has become an uninterrupted flow. You see? And one way to create this experience, for example, is through the practice of a mantra. You take one mantra and perhaps mentally we keep chanting it in a slow rhythm again and again and again. This practice is called japa. So we are using this mantra to limit the boundary of focus, right? So dharana is meant to happen. But between two mantras, the mind can still escape. You see? It's like the gap between the two drops of water. The mind can still think about something else in between the two mantras. So when the mind, with repeated practice, when after 5 minutes or 10 minutes of repeating the mantra again and again and again, then the mind gains the strength of momentum. It moves in the same flow and there is an uninterrupted flow. That is when meditation happens. So that's why Patanjali says, Tatra pratyaya ekatanata dhyanam. There. Tatra means there. When we are practicing dharana, the meditation will happen in due course of time. It will be allowed to happen in due course of time. And there are other methods of meditations as well, like visualizations, which are called upasanas. And there is a vipassana type of meditation where the method that is used is more like a witness consciousness. We just observe things that are moving in the mind without resisting them nor getting carried away by them. You see, there are many types of meditation.
Wonderful. And I think, you hit on the next point, which is going to be, right, we talked about dharana last week. And so being able to connect that with dhyana, like you mentioned, with the trickle by trickle, the drop by drop, I think that's another, further exemplification of how everything is so interconnected here. And you kind of have to think of everything as a connected pieces, set of parts, as opposed to, right, the one thing leading to another. And so I think
having
the other
said that,
thing.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Vedanji, but there's another very subtle point which I think is worth mentioning. So,
For sure.
Dhyana can happen even without one pointed focus. Even without dharana, dhyana can happen. So, let me give analogy so that we are able to understand how this happens. We looked at two metaphors before. One from the Bhagavad Gita that I said, which is the flame of a candle. Yatha deepo nivatasto nengate sopamasmrita. That means like a flame which is in a windless place. So when you look at the light that is radiating from the flame of a candle, it is radiating in all directions, 360 degrees. It's not like a flashlight, you see. It's not pointed to one area of focus. It is diffuse. The light is radiating 360 degrees all around. So even that can be meditation, because there also, when you take a snapshot of the flame of a candle and after 5 seconds take a second snapshot, the pratyaya, the image, will be identical. You see? So the mental image can be made to be identical. The pratyaya can be made to be identical even without one pointed focus. Whereas the example where we talked about the oil, when we pour the oil moves towards one spot. Right? It is more directed. It's not going 360 degrees. It's just moving towards one spot. So that is an example where we are combining dharana, like one pointed focus, with dhyana. So the point I wanted to make is that meditation can happen either with the one pointed attention, or it can be diffuse. And in some situations, this diffuse uh, state of mind where we are not focused on one thing can be helpful. It gives a deeper relaxation, right? We are not focusing on one thing, and it also helps us for the mind to be alert. For example, people who practice martial arts, so they want to be very careful what the opponent will do. They have to be alert 360 degrees. They cannot be focused only on their hand with their weapon, because they can strike with their leg, you see. So they need to be alert 360 degrees. So there, a diffuse state of mind helps, and there also meditation can happen.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think thanks for clarifying that point, because initially you would think that you kind of have to have all of these different parts working together to make the picture complete. But it sounds like they're not, I guess, necessarily precursors to one another, but the cumulative effect of having both is something that will allow you to feel a much more powerful effect, and just much greater, a much greater takeaway, if you will, from the practice than if you were to just have one versus the other. So I think
Yes.
that's a very important point too.
In fact, we are going to see that in a little more detail, perhaps in the next session, when we combine dharana, dhyana, and the next session when we talk about samadhi. Patanjali talks about that. What happens when we combine all three? And that's a very profound state of mind, and we will talk about it in one of the future episodes.
Definitely. So then I think now that we have the whole picture of how this concept basically ties out, how dhyana should work, what fundamentally it represents, conceptually, how should we think about it? Practically, why don't we maybe close with this, Shriramji? So practically, how should our listeners, be thinking about the concept of dhyana both on and off the mat? Obviously on the mat, right? We talk about the meditative state where you are, for example, if you're in a final position, right? There's that whole meditative state, that little microcosm of meditation that happens there. So not only that, but then also off the mat. So how should we, think about actually applying this concept of dhyana? I think a lot of what we talked about has been very powerful conceptually, but to a certain extent abstract. So maybe to crystallize a little bit more, how should we think about this?
In fact, one of the things that profoundly elevates the quality of our regular yoga practice is to integrate the practice of dhyana, integrate the practice of meditation in our daily sadhana. So, for example, when people are pressed for time, if they don't have, say, the full hour to complete their yoga practice, maybe they woke up a little late and they don't have the full time to practice, one of the things they do is chop off some of these practices, such as the meditation. But that's not a very good idea. In fact, it's a horrible idea, because meditation has so many benefits to offer. We saw so many benefits, right? And the clarity of mind and higher quality of thoughts, and it has physical benefits as well, profound physical benefits as well. And especially at the end of the practice of asanas, the postures, and pranayama, breath work, the mind is so ready for meditation. Remember, we said meditation, we allow that to happen. The key word is allow. So after asanas and pranayama, we are in that state where the mind is ready to be tranquil. We don't need to force it. The mind is already in that place where you can quickly slip into meditation. So let us not squander that opportunity. My teacher used to use the same words. He used to say, practice meditation every day after your asanas and pranayama, because the mind is so quiet after these practices. Why do you want to squander that opportunity? So complement your practice. In fact, meditation is one of the integral components of the daily sadhana. So when we consistently practice meditation as part of our holistic system of yoga practice every day, say perhaps we practice it in the morning, we set the tone for the whole day. You see, the mind is tranquil, and when we step outside our home to take care of our busy schedule and so forth, we are able to do that with a mind that is crystal clear. Because when the mind is in meditation, it is crystal clear. In fact, Patanjali gives this metaphor. He gives this example. He says the mind is like abhijatasyeva mani. Mani means crystal, and abhijatasyeva means blemishless or flawless crystal. The mind of a yogi who is in the meditative state is like a flawless crystal, like a diamond, you could say. So strong and so clear. You see? So when we practice meditation inside the yoga mat, then chances are our mind will be in that tranquil state during the course of the day. And the practice of meditation will not make you lethargic, because remember, meditation has this flow as well. In fact, whenever we want to be dynamic in our action, whenever we want to get a lot of things done, we can get more things done when we are anchored to ourselves. Within, there is a central place where we are anchored. And one of my teachers, Sri Ravi Shankarji, he gives a very beautiful acronym to remember this. He says, iPod, inner peace, outer dynamism. So inner peace, we are anchored to inner peace, and outwardly we are extremely dynamic. And for example, when we are looking, when we look at any machine or any device or instrument that moves very fast, say the wheels of a car, they are moving very fast. Yet the hub of the wheel, it needs to be stationary. You see, if the hub also starts moving around, then the whole thing wobbles, right? It cannot move as fast. You need a central place. The center of gravity has to be anchored. It has to be stable. And then the periphery can move in a very dynamic manner. You see? So with meditation, we are anchoring ourselves within, and from that place, we are able to accomplish much more. My teacher used to say, when we devote, say, 20 minutes of meditation every day, in the remaining 23 hours and 40 minutes during the day, we can accomplish about 50 hours of work if we were to go about without meditation. You see, so such is the power of meditation. It's like an investment that will profoundly elevate our what we accomplish during the day, and we do that with a tranquil state of mind, not with a state of workaholic or being exhausted frame, but a tranquil frame. So you can imagine that, right? It can be so powerful, tranquil at heart, yet dynamically accomplishing more than what is expected out of us.
So I guess the moral of the story there is that if people are running short on time, maybe they should cut down on the physical practice, but make sure that they definitely do keep the meditation going, because arguably, from a day perspective, you could argue that they will have much more benefit from that. So maybe that's a little nugget of advice that hopefully our listeners will take into account, and it's something that I think makes a lot of sense, because it sets you up mentally with the right frameworks and just the right sort of perspective, right, for the whole day, as opposed to, like you said, you may get your physical practice in, you may have a little breathing in, but then at the end of the day, if mentally you're not up to par or where you should be, then there's a high risk that your day is going to be set in a tone which is not the most optimal, because you're not thinking clearly, like you mentioned, you're not thinking efficiently, and as a result, productivity, your work, etc., will suffer from that. So that's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you brought it up, Shriramji, just so that our listeners, know that they should make sure that they keep at least, even if it's 10 minutes a day, right? Just something to basically make sure they do have some time to focus on the meditation. That'll be incredibly important. And then tying it back all the way. So I think now we know the concept of why Dhyana is so important, to basically understand, I think, conceptually what it is, but then more than that, figure out, okay, how can we actually think about applying these principles into our daily yoga practice, both on and off the mat. So I think it's been an incredibly productive discussion, and I know we're running out of time. It's been a very substantive discussion, a lot to discuss. Like you mentioned, Shriramji, there's a lot of good content out there to really, deep dive, and we just touched the surface in this discussion here, right? And there's so much more to study. But any last words of, advice, or just definitionally things you'd like to pass on to our listeners about the concept of Dhyana before we move on to the next episode, which will be the next week's episode, where we'll be closing up the loop on all the different Ashtanga Yoga components?
Yes. So one of the things that my teacher used to say is keep meditation as the central focus of your daily sadhana. And then around it, we weave in the practices such as the asanas and the pranayama and so forth. So the primary goal, in fact, the primary goal of yoga is Chitta vritti nirodha, where we silence all the mental activities so that there is perfect tranquility there. And the one practice that leads us directly to that place is dhyana, is meditation. So this is, we could say, this is the closest of the practices that achieves the ultimate objective of yoga, that yogic state dhyana gives you, the meditation gives you. So especially when combined with this holistic practice with asanas, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, all these together, they help experience such profound states of bliss that it's remarkable. And we will also see in the next week's session how, when we do this, when we bring the mind to a place of quietude or tranquility, it also helps us to harness some of the hidden powers of the mind. We make the mind more creative, and we tap into intuition and so forth. So we set up the foundation for all that. So meditation is profoundly beneficial.
And very powerful, right? So I think if that's the one key takeaway, it's probably, meditate more, and at least more than that, understand why it's so important to actually, pursue meditation. So I know I definitely will. So with that, why don't we go ahead and wrap up for today? So thank you again, Shriramji, for this very productive discussion on all the different topics that we just talked about. I think, for our listeners, and speaking from, experience here of just even, helping put together a little bit of the agenda, right? I think it's one thing to be able to read about this stuff, in the public domain, whatever's out there, right? But then being able to actually translate that from a very abstract nature to concretely, what does this actually mean, and how does it apply to you, right, is something altogether a bigger task altogether. So thanks for so clearly articulating this and putting it down in a way that we can really think it through and really understand the core essence of what dhyana really is. So with that, why don't we go ahead and maybe close out the session for today? And then next week, we'll be talking about the very last limb of the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy, which is samadhi, or the ultimate state of being. And so that'll allow us to hopefully bring everything a full circle, so we can kind of see how all the different limbs within Ashtanga Yoga kind of fit together, and how, all of these will allow us to get that ultimate, state of being. And so after that, it'll have been a productive discussion on all the different limbs within Ashtanga Yoga. So hopefully, to the listeners, you'll have been able to get some idea of what the different concepts within, the Ashtanga Yoga philosophy is, as well as how you can actually think about applying them to your daily lives. So with that, thank you, Shriramji, once again, and we'll speak again next weekend for the concept of samadhi.
Thank you very much, Vedanji, and thanks
Thank you.
everyone.